explain the composition lesson. And I've already met with a few of you, but this is for those of you that could not make the meeting today. So first thing I wanted to talk about was supplies. So if you look down here, I've got a few things that I wanted to talk about. So as long as you have some sort of pencil or some sort of ballpoint pen, you can still do all the projects and assignments that I'm asking you to. But there are a few extra materials that would make your life a little bit easier. So let's talk about paper first. So right here we just have the typical sketchbooks that we use in class most of the time. This is really going to be your best bet because it has mixed media paper. So that paper is going to let you use any kind of medium that you want. And if you don't have paint at home, if you have Crayola markers, so just like typical little markers, you can actually use those like watercolors. So you don't need anything fancy, just those markers. And just like a little Walmart paintbrush is fine. And you can do a lot with those. You can make a little palette and then paint with them, or you can color directly onto the paper and then kind of blend them to get some different watercolor effects. So that's one thing that you can do if you don't have good art supplies at home. Another thing that you can use that hopefully you have at your house is colored pencils, and you don't have to have fancy Prismacolor colored pencils. These are all different brands like Crayola. This is like cheaper than Crayola. This one's Faber-Castell. So I have just like a bunch of different brands of colored pencils. Any of them will work fine. You can do any of the projects with those. Another thing that I've seen several of you use, which is a great tool, is Sharpies. So these are semi permanent markers in that if you get them wet, they will smear a little bit. So be careful with that. But they work just like the fancy alcohol markers. All right, so if you do not have your sketchbook at home, don't worry. If you can find any kind of paper, like this is just like some random drawing paper that I found, you can use that. If you don't have anything like that at your house, you could actually do some paintings on cardboard, or this is like an old back of a sketchbook. And so if you have like house paint in your garage, you can just paint a couple layers of white paint on there, and then that is something that you can use as a drawing surface. And the little bumps and irregularities actually add a little bit of interest to your art. Okay, but what I'm going to show y'all today is just doing stuff on copy paper, because I assume that most of us at least have copy paper. Now keep in mind, like your sketchbook paper is definitely ideal. So if you have your sketchbook paper, use that instead of copy paper. All right, so what we're going to do today is kind of talk about the things in the lesson that I think were confusing to some of you. So these are my notes from earlier, but we'll take notes on composition, composition devices, and then we will talk about the project. And hopefully that will kind of clear some things up for you. So first of all, what I did is I don't have a printer at my house, so I went ahead and wrote out the notes. The worksheet is on Google Classroom, so you can just download it. If you have a printer, great, print it. This will that will save you a lot of time. But what I actually did is like folded up my paper and then folded it into 16 boxes, 16 for this one, 16 for this one, and then left some space at the top for me to write my title. You can also just draw 16 boxes in your sketchbook, one for each assignment. And these are 2 separate grades in Google Classroom. Okay, so what I'm going to get into is the actual composition. So let's talk about the why first. So the reason that we're learning about composition is because this is so important to you as an artist. You want to make sure that when you get into AP Art, or if you end up taking an art class in college, that you actually know what you're doing. So this is something that a lot of people are going to assume that you already know. So it's important that you know it. I had the experience of going to school and being an art major and not knowing this stuff ahead of time. And so a lot of times I would do one of these things on accident, and my professor would compliment me, but I wouldn't know how to duplicate that or how to replicate that. I couldn't make a good composition again, or I couldn't pick the right color scheme again. So that's why me and Miss Wright and Miss James, we're also passionate about y'all learning the basics so that you can do the right things and it won't be an accident. So the reason that we're teaching you this is so that you can make good art on purpose, not an accident. All right. So let's get into these different terms. And what I'm going to do is I'm just going to write like a short little definition up here, just a couple words to help us remember it. And then we're going to go back and draw these. All right, so the first thing I want to talk about, and hopefully you can see it up here on the screen, is leading lines. So leading lines is where you have lines that either go a certain direction or point to your subject. So you want to make sure that your lines um, move people towards what you want them to look at. So like one of my students pointed out earlier, a lot of this is about learning psychology and the human brain and how people work, and then kind of using that to your advantage. If you're in advertising, if you're in illustration, it is key that you understand and can use these composition rules to your advantage. All right, so well, let's look at the next slide. So right here on the screen, you should be able to see The Creation of Adam by Michelangelo. And so that's an example of what I'm talking about with leading lines. So having lines that point towards your subject. So here, the subject is Adam, but the subject is also God. So usually we look at a painting from left to right because we're Western. So the first thing that most Westerners would notice is Adam because he's on the left. But because he's pointing towards God, we should notice God next. And then all the other people are looking back at Adam. So that kind of makes your eye go in this kind of infinity shape back and forth. And the more people, the more time you can get people to spend looking at your artwork, the more successful it is considered. This next picture is a picture of a girl, and as you can see, her toes are pointing. And what we usually do is we start by looking at the left, so we see her foot, and then her legs should kind of point us back towards her body. And then her eyes are looking towards lines that kind of lead towards her as well. So it should keep your eye looking around the picture. All right, the next rule that I want to talk about is the 60-30-10 rule for color. So right there, if you don't remember anything else about color, remember that when you're picking colors for a design, try to stick to 3. And if you need more than 3, try to use like tints and shades of those 3 colors. And then what you're going to do is use them in the ratio of 60, 30, and 10. So think about a good suit, like the man in the picture is wearing. 60% of that suit is going to be one color. Then 30% of that suit is going to be the shirt. So it's going to be that other 30%. And then you've got, not very even, but then you've got a small 10% in things like the tie or the little ascot in the pocket. Those are going to be those little pops of that accent color. And so his jacket and pants, his shirt, his tie, 60, 30, 10. All right, the next thing is grounds. So for grounds, what I want you to think about is using foreground, middle ground, and background in all of your drawings. So each one of those images has something in the foreground, and then it also has stuff in the middle ground, and then it also has a background, and that's going to make your pictures have depth. Another thing that is important is thinking about breathing room. So make sure that your subjects do not have so much in the frame that it's overwhelming. You want subjects to have breathing room. And a lot of times that's going to have more of a dramatic effect or a symbolic meaning. Like this girl might look a little bit isolated because she has breathing room, but it's also more interesting than seeing a picture of her cropped in too close. All right, so give your subjects space. All right, then we get into depth. And the way you create depth is by using these different things to deal with space. So make sure that you use space rules. All right, we'll put that in quotes, space rules. So all the different things that we learned in Art 1 about making things smaller if they're farther away, or using lighter colors when things are farther away, all of those are going to help you create depth using foreground, middle ground, and background, giving your subject space. All of that is effective. Then the next thing I want to talk about is overlapping. So for this, I'm just going to write no, just touching. All right. So if you look back at the slide on the screen, you've got two cylinders that are just touching. That is awkward. That causes bad tension. It is also true when you have something just touching the edge of something. So if you have a picture and then like someone's head is like right here next to the edge of the paper, that is not good. That's going to make people feel uncomfortable when they look at your work. So think about that breathing room, and also think about either having something off the frame or completely in the frame. Look at the little cylinders back on the screen. You either want them apart or you want them actually overlapping. So with overlapping, that's very important for space. Then the next thing that you want to think about is point of view. So that is something that we talked about in Art 1 when we talked about bird's eye view. So I'm going to write that, BEV, bird's eye view, and worm's eye view. So just vary your point of view. Don't always be looking straight at a subject. Also, when you're drawing faces, think about using 3/4, think about using the profile, all those different things is going to make your artwork better, not always like dead straight on, because that will look very boring. Okay, so the next thing we're going to get into is the principles of design. So that was a review of Art 1 basically, but it's showing you how to apply those concepts to more advanced things. This is not something that I'm going to hold your hand through anymore, and no art teacher is going to hold your hand at this point. So I really want you to be able to apply the things that we learned about the elements of art. So shape, color, line, space, all of those become very important when you're creating your own art, and thinking about it and being able to articulate why something is designed well comes into using those rules in your work. Okay, the next thing I'm going to talk about is pattern, and I think I'm out of order a little bit with the slides, so I might jump around just a little bit. So let me go ahead and mention pattern. Using repetition of a design is going to help your artwork. So repeating elements in a pattern is going to make it very pleasing. Another thing is unity and harmony when things work together. Okay, next is balance. So actually the little drawing on the screen is perfect, but you want to think about the different types of balance. So you've got symmetry, then you've got asymmetry, and then you have radial. There is actually a few others, but those are the main ones. So thinking about, and I'm going to go ahead and do this right now while we're looking at it, is mine symmetrical, so the same on both sides, or is mine asymmetrical, so still balanced, but maybe not exactly the same on both sides? Those would be some examples of that. All right, then let's get into some of the other important ones. So movement is important, use it. Rhythm, same. This is pattern. Pattern is going to give things structure, so think about patterns that you find in nature or in clothing. All those are important in your artwork. Then we get into emphasis. So that's the same thing as focal point, making sure that you have something that you want the viewer to focus on. You want to make your subject the emphasis. And you can do that different ways. You can do it through color, you can do it through value, you can do it through size. All those are going to emphasize whatever you want the viewer to see. The next thing I want to make sure that I hit is repetition. You see if I've got a slide for that. I did not. Okay. So when you use repetition, that's going to be the same thing as what I was talking about up here with movement and then rhythm. So repeating things like shapes, colors, or lines throughout a work of art is going to give it unity and harmony, which is our goal. So if you had me for any other art class, I always talk about how unity is our goal. Harmony is the same thing as unity. So if I want my piece to work, I need to make things work together by repeating certain elements, by balancing my artwork, by having a focal point. All of these are really for our goal of unity to make good art. All right, so a couple other really practical things that we can take from this when we talk about composition is the rule that odd numbers work better than even numbers, always. So I'm going to write some odd numbers right there to help you remember 3, 5, and 7. Usually 1 is not enough, and usually more than 7 gets a little bit overwhelming. So you want to do things in groups of 3, 5, and 7. The brain likes to make pairs. So what's going to happen to people when they're looking at your artwork is if you have 4 birds sitting on a power line, the brain is going to go, oh, 2 birds, 2 birds, 2 birds, 2 birds. They're going to make all the different possible combinations, and then your brain's going to be done and move on to the next piece of art. Now this happens like in a split second, but if you have an odd number of birds, so you have 3 sitting on the power line, then the brain bounces back and forth saying, oh, those 2, that one's by itself. Oh, those 2, that one's by itself. Oh, those 2, that one's by itself. Oh, no. And it just keeps going back and back and back, trying to make pairs, and it can't. So this is happening subconsciously, but if you use odd numbers, it's going to make people look at your artwork longer, and it's just going to seem more balanced. All right, then what I'm going to do is fold this down so that y'all can see the bottom of my paper, and then let's talk about the other ones. Hopefully my camera does not fall. Okay, so then let's talk about cropping. So right there on the screen on the left, I've got 3 images that have been cropped. So I love the one of the tractor wheel. We know that it's a wheel, but because we can't see the whole wheel, our brain tries to complete the circle. So trying to complete the circle, once again, is making the brain do some work. And so when you make the brain work like that, it thinks about the picture longer, it looks at the picture longer, it stays in the brain longer. And so that's what you want. Also, don't be afraid to crop your subject. Like the hands have been cropped, but they are still very effective. Also, don't be afraid to crop things in the background, because if you show every single thing in its entirety, it's confusing to the viewer. They don't know what to look at. But in the picture right here where the bed is cropped and the picture is cropped, it helps me focus on the boy and what he's doing, which is the goal of this illustration. In this picture right here, it is hard in the first picture on the left, and I know it's very small on your screen. Because there is a house and because there is so much of that field, it is very hard for me to tell, like, does the photographer want me to focus on the woman or the house or the grass? In the next image, it is cropped so that I know, oh, okay, my focus should be on that woman in her very stark white dress against the background. Also the guillotine effect. So I'm gonna put this right here, helps focus. And then also guillotine, let me look, make sure I spell that right. All right, so guillotine effect, when you chop off the head of something, it's going to help us focus on something else. So we're naturally drawn to eyes and faces psychologically as humans. So if you have a head or a face, that better be your subject, because that's what everyone's going to be looking at. If you want us to focus on clothing, if you want us to focus on hands, a good idea is to chop off the head. And that is also called the guillotine effect. So if you look at these 2 pictures right here, you've got the couple. I focus on their hands because the top half of their bodies are gone. And then in the next image, in the first one, it's very small, but if you saw the image large, you would focus on his face because it's very compelling. But in the next image, because his face is gone, I now focus on his outfit. All right, the next one is framing. So use things to frame your subject. So make a frame in the picture. And you can do that through things like windows, trees, or you can actually physically draw some kind of frame around your subject. Another thing that you want to use is the rule of thirds. And I'm sorry if you can hear my dog. She sees something outside she wants to see. All right, so look at the 3 images at the top. None of those are really more interesting than any of the others, even though the middle one has a hand in it, even though the last one has really nice contrast. The composition is basically the same about all three of them. They seem pretty boring. If you turned in a portfolio and it was dandelions as your theme and every single picture looked like that, you would not score very well. But if you look at the picture at the bottom, that picture is automatically more interesting. And it is because of the rule of thirds. So let's look right here at the next two images. And I can't show you all the images that I had picked out for this. They're not all working on my new computer, but I'm going to show you down here basically the rule of thirds. So what you want to do on any kind of composition is think about your picture plane. Then you want to split it into thirds horizontally, and then you want to split it into thirds vertically. And I didn't draw that very straight, but you get the general idea. All right, so then where you want to place your subject is at one of these four intersections. So if you look back at the screen, the woman's head is at one of those intersections. The plant is at one of those intersections, and that's making the picture more interesting. And actually, I cropped the next image to show the woman cropped in closer. That it's kind of boring because there's no breathing room for her, and also it's not following the rule of thirds. But the human face usually follows that rule of thirds because usually we pick one eye over the other, so her eye is kind of close to one of those intersections, so it could work, but it's not ideal. Okay, so you want to divide horizontally and vertically, and then use an intersection. Hopefully that makes sense, and I'll actually showed it to you. Okay, then the golden mean, and this one is where you're getting into some college level stuff, all right? And this gets very mathy, and we all know I'm not very mathy. So the golden mean is a special number, kind of like pi, and basically the number is 1.618, so on and so forth. But what it does is if you take a number or a shape and divide it by that number, it's going to give you this golden spiral that's right here on the screen, and that is something that you will hear and you will want to use in your artwork. But I would master the rule of thirds before you tried to get into the golden mean. But Da Vinci uses the golden mean in all of his pieces. Ancient Greeks used the golden mean when designing their architecture. And then a lot of things in nature follow the golden mean. So for example, this shell right here on the screen, how the first section is so much bigger and then the smaller sections are those different divisions. If you look at a tree, and if you're struggling with drawing trees, this like perfectly explains it. So the tree branch is going to be that first section. It's going to take up most of the picture, and then you want like the next spread of branches to be that next size, then the next spread of branches to be the next size, until you get all the way down to the little tiny twigs that are coming off of the branches. So that is the golden mean. But what I would draw in that box is just a division that is a little bit more than halfway, then divide that almost in half, but a little bit more, then same thing, keep going till you get all the way down to this tiny little size. And I'm going to color in the middle box. That is your focal point. That's where you want your focal point to be. That's how big you want your focal point to be if you're following golden mean. All right, so that does it for these notes. So let's talk about some different drawings that you could do in the different boxes. And this is not something I'm not expecting you to do anything crazy involved. So let's just kind of go through this as quickly as possible. So for example, right here, if I want leading lines, I can do something like a horizon and a sun, and then maybe a road going back towards the sun, And then all these lines are leading towards the sun. Don't forget space, how these should get like slightly bigger and longer. And then have rays of the sun. All right, so all those lines are leading back towards the center point, and I could even put a little silhouette of a person against the sun, and that would definitely be my focal point. All right, I'm a little stick person, I can barely see. Okay, the color one, it's already drawn, just needs to be colored. So my main color is green. My next color is yellow. Those are analogous colors. Well, I'm using kind of a lime green and a yellow. And so they're going to look good together. And then pink or red is opposite green on the color wheel. So that pink is going to work really nicely as an accent color. All right, so there is the 60-30-10. Then for grounds, just make sure that you put something in the foreground. Then you want to have something in the middle ground. And then you can put something in the background, and having those different grounds is going to make your picture look more interesting and have depth. All right, then breathing room. So make your subject. And then give it some space by only putting, a few things. And that makes us look at the subject longer and notice that it has space around it. All right, then depth. There are a ton of different rules, but one thing I can do is draw something big in the front and then make things look smaller as they're going back in space. And that's going to make my piece look like it has depth. Oops, kind of messed up that square a little bit. All right, so that creates depth, and it does look like they're all on the same plane. So I can do something like that, make that my background, and that works. All right, then overlapping. For this one, I just want to emphasize the same thing that they showed you on the slide, or that I showed you on the slide, I guess, is that you either want something to be definitely overlapping, like these two cylinders, you would erase that part right there, or you want them to be definitely separate, like these two cylinders, all right? Not, whoops, that's kind of bad, not kind of just touching each other, like these two little baby circles. That's awkward. It's also awkward that this is just touching that line. So I think I'm going to kind of correct that as best I can in the space that I have. Okay, then point of view. Bird's eye view and worm's eye view is ultimately more interesting than anything else. So that's using that perspective again, and then drawing things from these exaggerated perspectives. Okay, we kind of got to where we can't see those. Perspective takes a long time, but it's definitely worth it in the end. Okay, so to make this have perspective, let's just kind of shade it. I don't want to spend all day on this, and I'm sure you don't want to spend all day watching this, but I do something like this. I would probably split right about there, even though I can't see it. And then do something where these are slightly different color. Do something down here, and that's gonna show you that bird's eye view where I'm like looking down. These lines are extra. All right, so that's that point of view deal, and I could actually color this black and it would look more like atmospheric. Okay, then pattern is just something where you repeat a design. So I'm just going to draw a bunch of circles, and that's the same thing I'm going to put on the other one. You can do a nicer pattern than me if you want to, but it's just something quick. Probably should have drawn the circles slightly bigger. And if you wanted it to be perfect, you could take a ruler and measure out a grid and all that good stuff. Okay, so there's my pattern. Then symmetry and asymmetry are you done? Radial symmetry would be like you have something in the middle and then you draw things around it. You could put that in that box instead. Repetition is then using similar shapes, colors, or lines. So I'm going to do something where I have a rectangle and I repeat that rectangle. So I'm going to vary the length and the size, but I'm going to repeat it. And that's going to make the whole piece kind of work together. Right. So repeating something, odd numbers, using 3, 5, or 7. So I'm just going to draw the same thing that was in the PowerPoint. Then focal point, emphasize something by either making it bigger or making it darker or making it a different color. So for this, I'm just going to draw a series of circles and make one of them slightly more detailed. And I'm also making it the largest thing in the frame. So that is obviously my focal point because it's the only one that has a spiral on it. Okay, then cropping is just not putting the entire thing in the frame. So I can do something where I only see part of someone's face. I'm just going to cover that ear. It's in here. All right, so I do not have to see the whole person. And I can still tell what it is. All right, then framing, doing something where you put a frame in the picture itself. I see this a lot in illustration work where people put a background behind their subject. And then draw whoever they're going to draw. and then putting just something like color in the background to kind of frame it. Think about all the stuff you see on Pinterest. Okay, then these two are finished. So that does it for our composition notes. So if you do something like this, just vary the drawings just a little bit. This is all I'm looking for those notes. All right, then composition devices. So this is another, thing that's going to take a minute. So if you want to pause the video right here, make a note of where it is and then come back to this later, that's totally